They called it the buzz bomb, a sound that arrived long before the explosion ever did. It began as a distant growl, grew into a metallic whine, and ended in silence, the most terrifying silence imaginable. And in that silence came fire. London, 1944. A city that had survived everything a human pilot could throw at it, now faced a pilot that wasn't human at all, the V-1 flying bomb, a weapon without conscience, without mercy, without a face, a steel insect with wooden wings, guided by gyroscopes and vengeance. Its pulse jet engine coughed at 500 miles per hour, carrying a single ton of high explosive, and an idea that fear could be mass-produced. The Germans called it Vergeltungswaffe 1, the weapon of reprisal. They wanted to prove that industry could still bite, even as their armies crumbled. Each launch was a message. You can bomb our cities, but we can build ghosts. And for months the ghosts were winning. Every day the sky rolled its dice. Anti-aircraft guns fired thousands of shells at invisible targets, their explosions timed by guesswork. Some burst too early, some too late, most nowhere near enough. Fighter pilots chased the V-1 safe, firing into exhaust trails or tipping them over with wingtips. Acts of desperation performed at the edge of physics. Spotlights scanned the clouds like trembling fingers, tracing death by habit. Each bomb was a coin flip heads, London, tails, Kent. For every missile stopped, 3 more reached the city. The British called it the robot blitz. Children learned to count by the rhythm of the engines. The buzz meant safety. Silence meant run. Even Churchill, who never admitted weakness, described them as the most devilish devices yet sent by human hands. But the truth was simpler. The V-1 wasn't devilish. It was disciplined. It did exactly what it was designed to do, and that was the problem. Somewhere across the Atlantic, another kind of engineer faced another kind of question. How do you make a weapon smarter than its user? Conventional fuses had served for centuries. They measured time, spinning clockworks or burning powder, primitive guesses against the chaos of motion. But time was the wrong dimension. War wasn't about time anymore. It was about distance. How, one scientist asked in 1940, can a shell know where its enemy is? No one laughed, because the question was madness, and all real progress begins with madness. At Johns Hopkins University, in a small division known only to a few, a team of physicists and engineers began to chase that question. Their names were secret. Their tools were fragile. They worked under fluorescent light and constant disbelief. Their mission to fit radar, an entire room of oscilloscopes and humming circuits inside the tip of a shell fired at 20,000 Gs. It was impossible. Vacuum tubes shattered under a sneeze. Copper coils tore themselves apart under acceleration. Batteries froze, circuits shorted, ideas exploded faster than prototypes. But war was the greatest laboratory ever built, and impossibility had a deadline. They built, they failed, they rebuilt. Hundreds of shells were fired into Chesapeake Bay. The ocean became their blackboard. Divers retrieved fragments. Engineers studied the wreckage, redesigned, refired. Every failure was data. Every detonation, an education. By 1943, the team had done it. A device smaller than a man's palm, lighter than a bar of soap, alive with invisible electricity. A fuse that did not wait for time or impact. It listened for proximity. It emitted a tiny pulse of radio energy, a heartbeat of electrons. When an object entered that field, the echo changed, a Doppler whisper, and the fuse answered with detonation. It was not a timer, it was a sensor. It was awareness compressed into glass and copper. The scientists called it the proximity fuse. The military, with its love of understatement, called it VT, variable time. But the name was camouflage. There was nothing variable about it. It was absolute. The fuse was so secret that even the men loading shells didn't know how it worked. They were told only handle with care, and if one falls into enemy hands, destroy it and yourself if necessary. Every shipment was guarded like a crown jewel. Every crate stamped with warnings written in the language of paranoia. A single captured fuse could have rewritten the war. So they buried it in secrecy, deeper than the Manhattan Project, quieter than the code breakers at Bletchley. And yet, its first test was almost accidental. A naval destroyer in the Pacific fired at a drone aircraft. One shell detonated mid-air, near enough to tear the target apart without touching it. The gunners stared. They hadn't hit it. They had predicted it. They didn't yet realize they were witnessing the birth of machine intuition. June 1944. The war in Europe was entering its final convulsions. But even as Allied troops fought their way across Normandy, the skies over Britain were once again filling with terror. Every sunrise brought a new swarm of shadows from across the Channel, V-1s, their crude pulse jet engines coughing out flame. They were not piloted. They were programmed. They flew low, steady, and blind, guided only by gyroscopes, fuel, and hatred. The British called them doodlebugs. Civilians learned to measure the seconds between the buzz and the silence. When the engine cut out, there were exactly 15 heartbeats to hope or to pray. In those days, hope was the only air defense that never ran out. Until the morning, the guns began to think. August 18, 1944. Dawn over southern England. The clouds hung low. The Channel wind carried the mechanical cough of vengeance. Below, a forest of anti-aircraft barrels pointed skyward. Men waited at their posts, numb from repetition. The VT Fuzes had arrived during the night. Crates stamped with American markings and warnings in red ink. No one knew what they were, only that they were to be guarded as if they breathed. The gunners were skeptical. Too many miracle devices had come and gone. But orders were orders. They loaded the shells. They checked the sights. And they waited. The first V-1 appeared just after 6, a speck of flame and sound crawling across the horizon. The guns opened fire. Normally, this was where disappointment began. But that day, it began with astonishment. One shell burst close, then another. Closer. The sky flared in rapid, synchronized blooms of light. The gunners cheered before they understood why. The first V-1 disintegrated mid-air, cut clean by a shell that had never touched it. The second followed minutes later, then a third. By noon, 82% of the incoming bombs were gone. By sunset, London's sky was clear. The impossible had become arithmetic. The VT fuse did not miss, because it did not guess. It listened, it measured, it decided. For the first time in history, a weapon possessed the illusion of judgment. The success was intoxicating, but secrecy was law. No newspapers, no speeches. The public was told only that the gunners had improved their training. The Germans noticed the change but could not explain it. They blamed altitude, wind, fate, everything except intelligence. They never discovered that their V-1s were dying at the hands of a new kind of enemy, a thinking fuse. To protect the secret, every dud shell was hunted down and destroyed. Even fragments were buried or melted. It was as if the Allies were hiding not a device, but a prophecy. In scientific terms, the VT fuse was simple. It emitted a steady radio signal, a faint, continuous wave humming into the air around it. When a target came close, that wave bounced back, changing frequency, creating interference. The circuit interpreted the echo as proximity and fired. But to the men who used it, it felt alive. They spoke of shells that knew when to explode, of ammunition that found its own range. The battlefield had gained a new sense, hearing through metal, awareness through electricity. It wasn't quite intelligence, but it was close enough to scare philosophers. As word spread through the inner circles of Allied command, the fuse was quietly shipped to every front. In France, in Italy, in the Pacific. Wherever men fought machines, the machines now fought back in kind. Artillery batteries equipped with VT fuses reported results once thought impossible. Enemy aircraft fell in swarms. Infantry caught in the open found themselves under invisible thunder, shells that burst perfectly overhead, turning air itself into a weapon. German soldiers began to speak of the sky that hates. They called it witchcraft. It wasn't. It was simply engineering without empathy. Back in the labs, the creators of the fuse were already uneasy. They had built it to save lives, to make defense efficient, to make war cleaner. But efficiency is a dangerous virtue. It erases hesitation. It removes choice. One physicist wrote in his notes, "We have taught the shell to think just enough to kill correctly." He didn't know whether to be proud or afraid. By the end of 1944, the proximity fuse had done more than protect London. It had changed the relationship between man and machine. It proved that electronics, once fragile, slow, and naive, could survive the brutality of war, could interpret the world, and could act upon it without human intervention. Every smart weapon, every guided missile, every radar-seeking drone would trace its bloodline back to that single circuit in a spinning shell, and yet no monument was ever built for it. No parade marched for the first machine that could sense, perhaps because it didn't fit the narrative of heroism, perhaps because it reminded everyone of something too uncomfortable, that thinking had just become optional. By the winter of 1944, the Allies had crossed the Channel, and the last empire of steel was retreating. But for every bridge they captured, every village they took, another V-1 still rose from its rail in occupied Europe. Each one carried a sound that no soldier ever forgot, a throbbing mechanical heartbeat echoing through the night. And somewhere on the English coast, 1,000 barrels lifted their eyes to meet it. They did not aim anymore. They listened. In the past, artillery was chaos with rhythm. Thousands of shells for a single hit. A dance of mathematics and luck. The VT fuse changed all that. Suddenly every round counted. Every explosion had intent. Radar operators began to report a new phenomenon, targets vanishing from the screen before they reached the coast. Entire waves of V-1s snuffed out in silence. The fuse was not just efficient. It was unnervingly precise. Shells detonated not a meter too early, not a meter too late, always where damage was inevitable. A machine had learned timing better than the men who built it. When field artillery commanders received the weapon, they were told it could do for ground combat what it had done for the sky. They fired the first test rounds over snow-covered fields. The shells rose, curved, and exploded above the ground, not in it, but over it, raining fragments downward in a perfect sphere of death. Soldiers who saw it said it felt wrong, too deliberate, too knowing. The air itself had become an accomplice. German troops soon gave the fuse another name, Der schlaue Tod, the clever death. They never discovered what made it work. They only knew that it worked too well. What the gunners never saw was what happened inside the shell. As it screamed toward the target, the tiny circuit inside it was listening, emitting radio waves, catching their reflection, calculating their delay. It was measuring distance at the speed of light, updating its awareness thousands of times per second. When the echo returned at the right frequency shift, when the math aligned with destruction, a switch closed and everything ended. No human eye could judge that moment. No hand could pull a trigger that fast. The shell had made the decision alone. In that instant, the line between weapon and intelligence had quietly blurred. Reports poured in from every front. In the Ardennes, entire columns of German troops were caught by shells that seemed to follow them through the fog. In the Pacific, Japanese aircraft were shredded in mid-dive, their pilots never knowing they'd been seen by an invisible ear. Everywhere the VT fuse appeared, the battlefield changed shape. Cover no longer meant safety. Speed no longer meant escape. Altitude no longer meant invisibility. War had always been fought between men and their limits. Now the limits themselves were dissolving. No new medal was minted for the proximity fuse. Its success was a secret, and its nature defied celebration. You couldn't shake hands with it. You couldn't thank it. It didn't fit into parades. It didn't salute. But among those who understood, there was an unspoken awe. Generals whispered that the fuse had shortened the war by months, perhaps years. Admirals said it had saved convoys, fleets, cities. Scientists said it had done something deeper. It had proven that awareness could be manufactured, that sensing could be designed, that judgment could be built. When victory finally came, the men who had worked in those quiet labs celebrated quietly too. They had built a device that made aim unnecessary, that made accuracy automatic, that made war almost mathematical. And yet, they were uneasy. Because once you teach a machine how to sense, you have to ask what else it might learn. One physicist, now older and pale from the strain, wrote in his diary, "We have crossed a threshold without realizing it. The fuse no longer obeys the gunner. It obeys its own perception." He had built precision, but precision had started to think for itself. When the war ended, millions of unused VT fuses filled warehouses and bunkers. They were disassembled, studied, repurposed. Their circuits found new homes in radar systems, missiles, satellites. The world had changed without ceremony. The fuse was no longer a weapon. It was a seed. Everything that came after, the heat-seeking missile, the radar altimeter, the autonomous drones, sprang from that first tiny brain of glass and copper, the first spark of machine judgment. The war ended with cities in ruin and nations exhausted, but something invisible had survived, a new kind of intelligence born in laboratories and battlefields, too small to see and too dangerous to forget. It didn't march in parades. It didn't occupy capitals. It simply waited, inside circuits and memories, quietly proving that the future would belong to those who could teach machines to decide. In 1945, the VT fuse was classified above the atomic bomb. The bomb was terrifying, yes, but it was obvious, a weapon of spectacle designed to end wars with noise. The fuse was different. It ended wars with silence. A single device that combined radio, computation, and autonomy, a fuse that sensed. While governments debated who would rule the post-war world, engineers quietly began dismantling their own creation. They studied its pulse circuits, its oscillators, its amplifiers, trying to understand how something so small could have changed everything. Those tiny vacuum tubes became blueprints. Within 5 years, they evolved into transistors. Within 10, into integrated circuits. The fuse had not just shortened a war, it had started an age. The world that followed was one of rapid acceleration. Radar became automation. Missiles learned guidance. Computers learned logic. And behind every new device, engineers could trace a quiet lineage, a thread of copper that led back to those glass tubes that once listened for echoes. It was more than technology. It was a way of thinking, the idea that machines could interpret reality on their own terms. In the 1950s, air defense networks began to appear, machines that tracked aircraft, calculated trajectories, and when authorized, decided when to fire. The first semi-automatic command systems, half man, half fuse. No one called them intelligent, not yet. But the fuse's logic, to sense, interpret, and act, was already guiding radar stations and early computers. The nervous system of war had begun to form. A decade after the war, a journalist visited one of the scientists who had worked on the VT project. He lived in a small house outside Baltimore. The reporter expected a man proud of his accomplishment, but found instead someone who looked burdened by it. The scientist, now gray and thin, said quietly, "We thought we were teaching the shell to see, but really we were teaching it to decide." He described those first tests, the thrill of watching shells detonate with impossible precision, the joy of perfection measured in destruction. Then his expression changed. "It wasn't the explosions that haunted me," he said. "It was the idea that they didn't need us anymore." He was talking about the future, but the future had already started listening. By the 1960s, the concept of the thinking fuse had spread across every domain of conflict. Submarines carried torpedoes that could sense the magnetic fields of their targets. Surface-to-air missiles learned to follow heat. Bombs sprouted eyes. War was becoming self-guided. The moral distance between cause and effect, once measured in human hesitation, was shrinking into the span of a microsecond. A commander could press a button and delegate thought to a circuit, and every time it worked, the world grew quieter about what that meant. For the generals, it was victory. For philosophers, it was erosion. The fuse had removed uncertainty from killing, and in doing so, it had removed a piece of humanity from decision itself. In time, what began as proximity detection evolved into pattern recognition. The same mathematics that let a shell measure distance would one day allow computers to measure difference between ground and sky, friend and foe, truth and lie. Every algorithm that learns from feedback, every system that detects, predicts, or corrects, is in essence an echo of the VT fuse. It listens, it measures, it decides, and we, the designers, have become its gunners. In 1980, at a technology symposium, a retired military engineer was asked which invention of the 20th century had most changed warfare. People expected him to say the bomb. He didn't. He said, "The fuse that thought." When asked why, he replied, "The bomb ended one war. The fuse began all the others, because after 1944, no weapon ever fired blind again. Every bullet, every missile, every guided system since has carried a small part of that original idea, that machines can perceive their world better than we can. It was not a fuse anymore. It was a philosophy. There is a photograph, grainy, overexposed, of a gun crew on the English coast. 5 men in heavy coats standing beside a 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun. They're smiling at something outside the frame. You can almost hear the wind. They don't know they're part of history. They don't know that inside each shell they loaded was the ancestor of everything that would follow. The caption reads only, Kent, August 1944. But the real story didn't end there. It was just beginning. Today, every guided weapon, every autonomous system, every drone that patrols the sky can trace its ancestry to that tiny glass tube, the first circuit that felt the world and reacted. In a century defined by machines that think, the VT fuse was the first neuron. The logic was simple. Emit, listen, decide. The consequences were infinite. From that simplicity came radar-guided missiles, then heat-seeking ones, then computers that could track multiple targets, then satellites that could see the entire planet. Each step more abstract, each step further from the trembling human hand that once pulled the trigger. The fuse had done more than revolutionize war. It had rewritten what reaction meant. In the 1950s, as the Cold War spread, engineers who had worked on proximity fuses found themselves recruited again, this time into the race for space and computation. The same circuits that once detected planes over Dover were now measuring the distance between Earth and the Moon. The same equations that calculated detonation range were guiding spacecraft into orbit. The fuse had gone from weapon to instrument, from destruction to discovery. It was poetic, almost redemptive. But the irony remained. Progress never abandons its origins. It only refines them. The guidance computers of Apollo, the targeting systems of modern missiles, the sensors in autonomous vehicles, they all share a single inheritance, awareness born from conflict. Listen closely to the hum of a modern city, the elevators that adjust their speed, the traffic lights that sense approaching cars, the drones mapping the sky above them. They all listen, calculate and decide, a faint echo of the shell that once listened for the approach of an aircraft. Every automatic reaction, from an airbag deploying to a missile changing course, is part of the same lineage, the same whisper of logic, repeated in silicon instead of glass. If near, act. The fuse's code became civilization's reflex. The VT fuse taught us something more than engineering. It taught us about proximity itself, that knowing how close something is means having the power to decide when to act. In the modern world, we have replaced explosives with data, bombardment with algorithms. We track not planes, but people. We predict not impact, but behavior. And once again, our machines listen for echoes, not of metal, but of patterns, of habits, of thought. The difference between sensing an aircraft and sensing a human is only a question of tuning. The fuse taught us how to hear the future approaching. We just haven't decided what to do when it gets too close. After the war, most of the VT fuse's inventors disappeared into academia or obscurity. They never sought fame. Many of them felt uneasy when they saw what their creation had become. One of them, a physicist named Merle Tulve, was once asked what the fuse had meant to him. He answered slowly, "It taught us that thinking doesn't have to mean understanding." The fuse didn't know what it was doing. It just knew when. He paused, then added, "That's the danger, isn't it? Machines that always know when, but never ask why." That single sentence became the quiet epitaph of an age. The VT fuse was built to end a war, but it became the first echo of the next one, the war between instinct and instruction, between human intent and machine precision. Its descendants now fly over cities and oceans, guided by sensors 1,000,000 times faster, but no wiser. Every radar pulse, every laser rangefinder, every proximity alert is a digital echo of that first fuse's heartbeat. The reminder that progress never forgets what it learns. The fuse changed the world, not because it thought, but because it listened. It forced humanity to confront the possibility that awareness does not require consciousness, only circuitry. And in that revelation lay the quiet terror of the modern age, that perfection requires no emotion and precision needs no permission. The first machine that learned to think did not dream. It detonated.